One of the other major news stories in the last few years in Australia has, of course, been the refugees on Manus and Naru who have been detained there. Uh, I wondered, if you are elected to the Senate, what will you be doing in regards to the case of Manus and Naru? Uh, What do you think should be done with the people who are still on Manus and Naru?
Well, in my opinion, they should be brought to Australia and allowed to live in the community and at an appropriate time be allowed to apply for citizenship. There's a great, I mean, I got involved in the refugee issue because of the Tampa case, which was, the Tampa was a Norwegian cargo ship, which was asked by the Australian government to go to the rescue of some people in a refugee boat, which the Australian government was aware of. That refugee boat had run into physical difficulties. It had basically fallen apart and all the refugees were in the water. The captain of the Tampa later said he'd thought there were maybe 50 people on the boat, and he was astounded when 438 people walked up the rope ladder onto the deck of the Tampa. Now, the people on the deck of the Tampa were in a pretty difficult position, and I was asked to act for them pro bono by a solicitor who had recently briefed me in a case concerning a fugitive Mexican banker. And I said yes, not because of any interest in refugees or concern about refugees, because I knew nothing about refugees back then. But ever since childhood, I've suffered from the heat very much. And I thought, these poor buggers, they're sitting on the steel deck of a ship in the tropical sun. That must be dreadful. We've got to do something to help them. So that's how I got into it. Now, by getting into that case, I came across a lot of people who knew a great deal about refugees, and I learned a lot about what was going on, not least of which that refugees who arrived in Australia without prior permission would be locked up until they received a visa or until they were removed from Australia. Pretty dreadful when you think about it. The Tampa case ran for, I think, 6 days, and the judgment, which was in our favour from the trial judge, was handed down in Melbourne at 2:15 in the afternoon Melbourne time on the 11th of September 2001. About 8 hours later, the attack on America happened, and all of a sudden, the then Prime Minister of Australia started calling boat people illegals because his assumption was that all boat people were Muslim and all Muslims were dreadful. That was the crude logic that he worked on. That case probably changed the direction of my life in a number of ways, not least because I became active in the public, trying to change the public's mind. It also, my wife, who's an artist, said, this is outrageous. You know, most Australian homes have got a spare room, and we should set up spare rooms for refugees. The idea being that you'd use your spare room to give someone free accommodation. And I said, well, if we're going to do that, we have to lead by example. So from late 2001 to the present, we've had refugees living in our house with us. That's been very, very useful, because what that taught me is that just like other people, some refugees are fantastic, most are just ordinary, and some are not great. But it's just like real people, just like the rest of us, you know? And that's a very useful thing to learn. So the Tampa also, the Tampa litigation also resulted in the Australian government setting up Manus and Naru as places of offshore detention. There's a bloke in detention in Melbourne at the moment who arrived just after July 2013. As a result, he was sent more or less automatically to Manus, being an unaccompanied male. He was recognised by the Papua New Guineans as a refugee, and he started suffering medical problems which the PNG system was incapable of remedying. As a result, he was brought to Australia for medical treatment under what was called the Medivac legislation, which has subsequently been repealed. Anyway, he was brought here about 8 or 10 months ago for specific medical needs. He has not yet received the medical treatment that he was brought here for. He's held in detention, even though he was brought here by Australia and is recognised as a refugee. And he's been told privately that it will be 2022 before he gets the medical treatment that he was sent here for. So, you know, I think the people we've sent to places like Manus and Naru really should be treated decently, like the human beings that they are. We've got people in detention, refugees in detention, who've been in detention for 9 years. Now that's pretty much the time you'd get in jail if you're convicted of murder. Now, these people haven't committed any offence at all, and yet they are locked up and treated like criminals. And at the moment, there's a very serious problem with coronavirus because some of them are kept in what's called community detention, which means that they're in the Mantra Hotel in Preston, which is not very far from the main detention centre. And they are held like 4 or 5 people in one room, absolutely rock solid conditions, the sort of conditions that are very likely to lead to them getting coronavirus. And yet there they are. They've committed no offence. They're held in conditions which will probably produce coronavirus.